With us, though, is our guest here. And actually, you're the son of the guest. And anyway, so welcome aboard to this is Tim Hale. And Tim, you are the defendant. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm one of many, but yes, sir.
One of many J6 defendants. And happy to have you on, and happy to have you tell your story about what's going on in your plight. We've been listening to J6 people for several weeks actually, and some of the people I actually personally know. So, and we're going to continue to follow up. They're still arresting people. I'm sure you're probably aware of that. We just recently had one of our people get arrested here out of California, about a week and a half ago.
Absolutely.
So tell us your story and what's going on with. First of all, what is going on with you, and then tell us your story. How about that one? How you got there?
Sure. Well, first of all, I've already been sentenced. I've already done my time. I got a 4-year sentence. I did 3. That's primarily because of President Trump signing the First Step Act. So even out of office, he's still helping the country. So that's good. I was arrested very early on, like right after January 6th. I was turned in by a roommate. So basically,
Nice.
yeah. I mean, I was locked up pretty much for the entirety of the last 3 years. So I just got out a couple months ago. So yeah, I was in the DC jail for approximately 2 years, and then I did about a year in FCI Fort Dix here in Jersey, which is ironic because when I was in the Army, I worked on Fort Dix. So it was nice to see the other side of the fences there. Not really. There's a lot I could tell. I don't know if you're interested in hearing about a lot of the other defendants. One of the things I try to do when I do this is I try to talk about a lot of the other guys who are now, unfortunately, they never got interviews when they were in jail, and now they're in prison, so they can't even defend themselves. I have a lot of information I can share with the public that is not being covered by the media. So there's a lot I could say.
Let's get started on what you got there, brother, because
Sure.
I think that this is, it's your chance to download and let us know what's going on and letting the public know what's going on. So go ahead.
Absolutely. One of the things to just go through, I brought a stack of documents because I mean, this seems so far removed from reality until people see it. So I mean, like this is a map of not very easy to see, but this basically shows you how many cameras there are throughout just the Capitol grounds. This doesn't even cover the cameras in the Capitol building.
Right.
And so what they do is they do these protective orders to try to basically, they're kind of like gag rules or gag orders to keep defendants from telling the truth to the public. So this is how they've been able to bury the truth of what actually happened that day. And honestly, most of those cameras a lot of them are not actually accessible to defendants, and that's not even all the cameras. There are thousands of cameras that we know just are not accessible. So they're hiding a lot of the evidence. And I'm not a total cynic, but I had a lot of hope for Speaker Johnson that when they said that they were going to release the video, that they were going to do it, and they're not doing it. Unfortunately, like at the rate that they are releasing anything, it's going to be 40 years before it's all available. And this is ignoring the fact that they're blurring a lot of the faces of people in the crowds. And the reason they gave is that it's to protect people's identities. But the truth is that the DOJ already has that video, and the sedition hunters can find people anyway. And so it just seems like they're protecting federal assets in the crowd. Not everybody might want to accept that accusation, if you want to call it an accusation, but that's what I think it is, because I know from firsthand experience, there were a lot of assets in the crowd. You want to call them crisis actors, contracted provocateurs, whatever. That's a thing. That's real. I met people inside the DC jail. I'd say about a third of the people I was in there with were either federal informants or they were Antifa. And this is something that people don't want to hear because we're caught in this weird dialectic. I was a history major. I don't know if you studied Hegel or philosophy, but you have in a dialect, it basically like there's this insurrection narrative, right? And then there's a counter narrative, and it's a controlled counter narrative. They want you to think all bad or all good, but that's not the case. There were bad actors there. And I'm not saying everything that happened at the Capitol is okay. But we need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. We need to be able to separate the diamonds from the dunghill. And nobody wants to do that because it's easier to control the narrative. And so I'm going to say we know that there were assets there. There was an FBI informant named James Knowles who testified at some of the Proud Boy trials. So, and he was involved in several breaches. He was actually next to me in the Capitol Visitor Center. Why wasn't he charged? No, they raided Christopher Cuny. They arrested Billy Cressman, and they kept him incarcerated. And they just charged him. They just convicted him for sentenced him to 4 years. So all this stuff about Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, blah, blah, blah. But then what about all these informants? You know, most Americans probably don't really think about this, because before Trump and before January 6th and all this, people just thought, oh, well, you know, the ends justify the means. But informants have now been weaponized to such an extent. Mm-hmm. I mean, you look at the Michigan kidnapping plot with the Governor Whitmer thing. Think about how many of those guys were actually federal informants. Think about, it's insane the scale to which they're going to entrap people. So I didn't mean to ramble about all that, but people need to know this isn't a theory. You're going to have the fake news say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. It's not. We know some of their names of these informants. It's a thing. People are starting to hear about Ray Epps. Ray Epps was one dude. There was an army of people working with him that day.
Yeah, so, agent provocateurs. Just that we were broadcasting at the time of that speech, and we had several people from our area that were there and were Facebook, you know, that sort of thing. And we were getting we were hearing the barkers, you know, the agent provocateurs, and we kept telling our people, don't go to the Capitol. I mean, we were doing that on air, saying, don't go to the Capitol, stay there, go home, go away, but don't go. It was because it was a trap. It was heard. Just from our distance, you know, we're out in California and we're hearing these barkers that you're talking about, agent provocateurs, that were absolutely encouraging people to go out there. But the PA system, what I found interesting was the PA system, at least from my vantage point, was all screwed up, and you really couldn't hear Trump talk, but you could hear the barkers very clearly. You could hear them very clearly.
It's such an interesting place, because I don't want look, there's the saying, never attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity or just whatever. You can never know what's in another man's heart. But from my perspective, I went there to hear Trump speak. I didn't go there to hear random, you know, NPC number 35 yell into a bullhorn. So why are there so many people? And this is an interesting thing, and this might be controversial. There are all of these. So there's a support group that was founded after January 6th called Patriot Freedom Project. And, you know, it was started to help the defendants and their families who were rotting in the DC jail, and it expanded and all of that. But over time, a bunch of copycat groups started popping up. Yep. And, basically, one thing that's interesting is if you look at video, the people who are in charge of all these organizations are those same people you just mentioned who are on bullhorns directing people to the Capitol. Right. All these carnival barkers got no time or very little time. They got slaps on the wrist if they were charged at all. And now they're in charge of basically controlling the narrative of January 6th. So while I was rotting in prison in jail for 3 years, these guys have been making these organizations to control the narrative, control the media access, and all of that. And this is what they do. I mean, if you've looked into this, I'm sure you've heard of Operation Mockingbird or COINTELPRO. So we know every 3-letter agency has this. We can't even pin it on one group. But the controlled narrative has been something that's gone on since at least the 60s. I'd say the 50s. You look at Operation Ajax. Color revolutions are not new. It's kind of new that we do it to our own government, you know, in our own country. But color revolutions aren't new. We've been doing this for decades. So it shouldn't surprise people. It's hard to swallow, but it's the truth. And it's self-evident at this point. It's been 3 years. The problem is there's just not enough information for people to really put it together. So I'm happy to always kind of put that information out because I have so much of it. That's why they kept us detained.
Yeah, this is a serious thing that when you take a look at it, and your reference to Hegel and Hegelian dialectic is right on. That's exactly what they've been doing. You know, Laura Logan was on the Hill yesterday, and she was talking about, you know, this is a war for your mind, basically, like Alex Jones would say. But it's all about the media. It's all about the narratives. Laura came and spoke to our 10th Constitutional Convention that we had in Anaheim, and she laid it all out just like she did yesterday in this communications. That's why I say when I go back and I listen to this and think about it, and as I was talking to people on their cell phones, go away, don't go over there. It was to me, being in sound, you know, it was odd that the president's sound was down and muffled, but you could hear the barkers. And that was, to me, I said to them at the time, these are agent provocateurs, and get away from them. Don't follow their commands. There's something going down, and something went down. It's pretty obvious that something went down. But I guess the bigger question is, there's a lot of people that are still incarcerated, and they're still looking for more. Now, what we think that they're looking for are people that are specialty items and maybe politically useful tools for them to arrest at certain specific times as we get closer and closer to the election. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, yeah, they're bragging they're going to get another 1,000. I think they've got anywhere from 12 to 1,300 right now. What I think they've been doing too, because a lot of these are like late arrests, and this isn't to throw shade at any particular individual. I know they're arresting a couple of journalists. I think that's to make a point, but I think also they're burning a lot of the assets they had. So I always caution that I think it's a mixed batch. I think that because if you really look into this stuff, they burn their assets all the time. And if they suspect, like, I don't know if you've heard of the 1512 charge, the obstruction of an official proceeding charge, 18 USC, that's up in front of the Supreme Court right now. So after abusing that for 3 years, they've kind of stopped charging people with it. So there's a possibility that gets tossed out, in which case they don't really, they're probably just going to keep hitting people with misdemeanors or whatever. In which case, it's really not a big deal for them to arrest some of their own assets and give them a misdemeanor and then send them on their way. They've probably been doing that for the past 3 years.
So they got to have the cover on that. They have to give them the cover that they arrest them. And as you know, these guys are, these agent provocateurs are trained to understand they're going to get arrested. That's just part of what they do as their job. Yep. Get arrested and sit in cells for days or months or whatever as part of what they've been commanded to do.
I can tell you. I can tell you firsthand too. With that 1512 charge, I mean, there were a couple defendants, there were co-defendants, and they confessed that they were actually at the Capitol to get out of trouble for something they did before January 6th. One of them was caught in a drug conspiracy, for instance, in 2020, and so they were actually, what they were doing was they were working off their debt to the feds. They basically got turned out as assets on the ground, and basically, it's a slap on the wrist compared to what they could have gotten. And so this is another thing that people don't realize is, like, a lot of informants are actually, whether they were involved in drugs or whatever, they got caught in trouble. And then they got turned into assets. And so there's so many different levels to this: actual agents, contractors, and then provocateurs or whatever assets on the ground who were basically enlisted into doing this in order to get out of trouble for something else. The feds do that all the time. And it's unfortunate, and I think it's totally against the concept of due process. I mean, entrapment is. So, but yeah, I mean, they confessed to this, and these were also the first defendants who had the 1512 charge upheld in federal court. So the first defendants to have 1512 upheld in federal court were also federal informants, and the 1512 is being used against President Trump. I mean, it makes this all look like this was a Trojan horse from the very beginning, and that's what I think it was. They used us against bait. I mean, my biggest regret is that I was used as a weapon against President Trump, because now if they can do this to President Trump, they can do it to anybody. We used to say that if they can do it to us, they can do it to anybody. But if they can do it to President Trump, they can definitely do it to anybody.
They accuse him of insurrection when in fact it's the government in doing its insurrection against us, we the people.
Yeah,
we've been trying to tell people that's the way you look at it. You should, because their narrative is it's individuals against the government. That's an insurrection, and that's not the case. Clearly, in this particular situation, you have somebody who's failing to perform his constitutional duties, such as somebody who wasn't even elected properly. That's Biden, but he's failing on all elements of that. And if somebody's failing to perform that, then stands in a state of insurrection against the Constitution or what he took an oath of office for. That's the insurrection, not Trump, not you, not me as individuals. There's nobody who's running around gathering up weapons and it's trying to create a war. That just isn't happening. There's demonstrations going on, and quite frankly, I think the entrapment that I saw right away were the officers opening up the doors. I mean, those are magnetic doors. They could have locked everybody out. I mean, do judges just not see that?
They don't care.
They
And
don't care.
it's so obvious. You mentioned the magnetic door. Like, one of the Oath Keepers were accused of being responsible for the breach of the Columbus doors, but the Oath Keepers walked through open doors. Those doors were opened up by a dude named George Tenney, and he was only able to open the doors, the magnetic doors, after he looked up at the CCTV cameras. He looked up and he pointed at the doors. Suddenly, he's able to open the doors after he couldn't before. And they testified at my trial. The CCTV is all monitored by the Capitol Police in an off-site facility outside of the Capitol building. They were watching that, and they let it happen. And that breach of the Columbus doors, those magnetic doors, that happened roughly the same time that all this other stuff was happening. There was a breach into Crypt Lobby East from the crypt, which allowed people to flow into the Capitol Visitor Center, which is where I wandered into. I didn't know that breach happened, but this is all timed. There were zip ties that were placed on the outside of the memorial door. And when this happened, there was a random smoke attack with a fire extinguisher, and the cops had to be diverted so that they could open that door up. And that diverted police presence from the crypt, which allowed that breach to happen. And who was in that breach? FBI informant James Knowles. Let's not be foolish. I guarantee you, he was not the only guy there that was an asset. And so there's so many moving pieces to this, but people aren't even being shown this. Like, you get the same 20-second clip for 3 years being played of like someone breaking a window, and it's like, okay, that's not good, but what about all the other stuff that's happening? What about the fact that the majority of people who wandered in, like me, I'm not saying I should have been in the Capitol building, but I wandered in. I walked in behind a bunch of other people through an open door. You can actually see me stop and go back in the other direction on the CCTV. And so, I mean, this is just what they do, though. They want to convict every defendant for what every other defendant did. It's not due process. It's not fair. I mean, I served my country for the better part of a decade, actually for 12 years in two different branches of the DOD for, one way or another. And they basically used offensive memes from my phone to make me look like a far-right extremist when I'm just a troll. And, it's like, there's nothing sacred in this country. They've attacked the First Amendment. They've attacked, the 4th and 5th, the 6th, the 8th, then the 14th. And, it's kind of sometimes it gets annoying to hear it every now and then. What about Antifa and BLM? Because it seems like maybe that doesn't really get to the root of what actually January 6th was. But there is truth to it. Selective prosecution, the 14th Amendment, equal protection. The Constitution has been gutted, and January 6th was a Trojan horse to do so. And there's so much more I could say, because I know that I have the names. Like on my Twitter account, I post the names of a lot of the informants and agitators that I met and who confessed to it. And the media is not going to run that. It's very rare that someone like yourself has a podcast and they're willing to, have an uncontrolled dialogue. But the truth is that, like, they've been, for 3 years, they've controlled this narrative for 3 years. Mm-hmm. That's why they pushed the insurrection thing so badly, or so much, even though no one was charged with it, because they've kind of like just infected people's brains with this controlled narrative. And now we're getting into the controlled counter narrative because it's an election year. But there's so much truth in the middle that's being lost by both sides.
Well, I found it very, very interesting, the committee that they formed in the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi. I thought was the J6 committee. I thought it was just appalling, the information that was coming out and what was coming up and how they were using it. But this is, unfortunately, we have the Patriot Act and we have several other things, National Security Act and all that stuff. These are the things that brought what you got to you. It's time to, I think, we repeal those, or we not allow those to come back into force. I think one of them is due up for an extension or something like that. We need to stop that because people aren't going to get due process, and because they aren't getting it now, because it's by the whim of basically what the president or executives in the executive branch want to say is an insurrection, and they can take you and hold you without any kind of cause, or which is exactly what they did with you. Now, when you were in the DC gulag, as everybody calls it out here, what was life like there?
I'm going to give you as fair an account as I can, because I feel like I hate atrocity propaganda. So, like you just mentioned, the commission, where you have all these cops saying, "Oh, I was covered in blood, I was knocked out." Like, it's fake news. That's not. All those officers there predominantly were lying. So I want to be as fair as I can, because a lot of misinformation comes out of the jail because of the reasons I've said. You
Right.
can imagine why. Controlled narrative, but it was terrible. It was solitary confinement for many months. First it was 23 in 1, so 23 hours in our cells, 1 hour out. And they used COVID-19 as an excuse. So, I mean, I'm from New Jersey. I think you're from California. I mean, if you know how blue states were, Washington, D.C. was no different. But it's interesting, the hypocrisy, because actually, ironically, my judge ruled, I think it was involving the Catholic Church, that Mayor Bowser couldn't keep religious services shut down in Washington, D.C. under the guise of COVID, because the Constitution doesn't get suspended just because there's an emergency.
Right.
That didn't apply to the jail, even though it was a government facility. And even though the marshals did contract with them, it was still D.C. technically. It wasn't federal. So Mayor Bowser had no really there really shouldn't have been any excuse to keep locking the jail down. But we were denied religious services. We were denied access to our attorneys. We were denied family visits. We were denied access to our discovery, our evidence. Half the time we were denied access to fresh air and the outdoors. We were kept in one pod, it would be called, one wing of the jail basically the entire time. And I mean, this is why I talk about like the controlled narrative thing, because if you ask a lot of people who've been doing interviews somehow from solitary confinement for 3 years, because that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. They'll all talk about, oh, the food is bad. The food is bad. It's like, yeah, the food's bad, but it's jail. The real issue is that you're a pretrial detainee and you can't leave, because typically if you're in jail, you're not going to be held for 3 years before your trial, because theoretically, if you do get convicted, you're going to go to prison and the food will be better there and yada, yada, yada. So like a lot of the people who talk about the DC jail, they don't talk about the real issues inside of it. The real issues were about due process. And I would say about generally the Bill of Rights and about the 14th Amendment, because there was a point where they stopped using COVID, where COVID was inapplicable, but they still treated us very differently than defendants throughout the other side of the jail. We were held in what was called CTF, Central Treatment Facility. The main jail is CDF, Central Detention Facility. And so they segregated us away from the rest of the jail, and they housed us in essentially, and you can get this from the name, an insane asylum. It was a madhouse. Central Treatment Facility. You had human waste and hair and clots and all this stuff jammed into the corners of every cell. It was repulsive. And one of the guards, who was a little more honest than most, he actually told us straight up, they cleaned that jail out for us. Cleaned it out, not well enough. They cleared it out for us weeks before January 6th. They knew we were going to be there.
Yeah.
So on some level, who's in charge of that? Is it the DOJ? Is it Mayor Bowser? Is it both? Is it Nancy Pelosi? I don't know. But, there was certainly more going on than meets the eye. Over time, though, the conditions did improve. We were not in our cells we weren't in solitary confinement the whole time. So people are still saying that. That's not true. And if people are saying that they're getting beaten every day by the cops, that's not true. A lot of the issues, honestly, some of the worst issues in the jail were from other defendants. Some inmates were actually informants and they were trying to sabotage other people's cases. That happened to me. There was a small cabal in there that was trying to basically write hit pieces about me for NPR right before my trial. And my prosecutors actually cited these hit pieces at my sentencing. I got over twice my sentencing guidelines. I should have gotten time served at like 20 months or so, 21 months. And instead I had to do 48 months. And again, thank God for the First Step Act, because I didn't have to do that full thing. But just in principle, you got these people who are cooperating, who are trying to sabotage other people's cases. And that was really one of the worst parts about being in the jail, because the media was trying to, and I tell you about, again, controlled narratives. They were trying to make us think that we were all on the same side.
Right.
While they were pushing us down, while their boot was on our neck, they were publishing articles out there about how, the DC jail, they're a cult, they're a college of collusion. And psychologically, that's supposed to make us band together stronger. But it wasn't a college of collusion. It was a psyop. You know, we were basically in, like I said, it was a mix between an insane asylum and an FBI field office, really. And so you had people who worked on their. It's funny, but like it's so crazy because it was like Groundhog's Day. People did like these skits, these scripted things, and then like the next day you're supposed to forget that it happens. It was nuts. It was nuts. And but like a third of the people there actually worked on their cases, whether they went to trial or not. At least they worked on their cases. They looked at the discovery. They looked at evidence when it was finally available. You know, they actually fought for their freedom. And then you had another group in the middle. And then the last group was like doing interviews nonstop for 3 years. So they have like this cult status out here on the outside, even though they're actually confidential informants. And so it's just bizarre. And so, I mean, that's what people need to know. I'm not saying it's this ratio particularly. Not all January 6th defendants are the same. If we are who we say we are, right? I'm just some dude. I was just there for a speech. And then I found out there was going to be a protest, and there's this caravan of people going to the Capitol. And it's like, okay, I didn't see barriers get knocked down. That happened a half hour before I showed up. And so I just wandered in. You know, I was also, let's keep it real. I was a little agitated because the cops were spraying people. And, you know, you don't see the buildup to all this. And so, like, not everybody was there for the right reasons or for the same reasons. So, but if what we say is true about ourselves, then we're random people. We're not celebrities. I'm just some guy. But then you've got other people who've tried to become like superheroes out of this for the past 3 years. And it's very suspicious. And it's usually the people who shouldn't be trusted. And, you know, people need to make up their own minds. You know, I'm like I said, I've been a troll for 20 years. I'm not like perfect. I'm kind of a jerk. But at the end of the day, I'm willing to be honest enough to get myself in trouble. You know, I'm out right now. But who knows? If I say the wrong thing, maybe they'll come get me. I don't know. But I'm saying I'm telling the truth, and it's uncomfortable. But you know, I played it smart. I collected the statements and testimony of my fellow defendants while I was locked up. We named the informants. You know, we named the people who were sabotaging our cases. We named the people who were grifting and stealing from the public for 3 years. People like, oh, I'm a hero. Give me money. It's like, well, you're a single childless man, and you got all these defendants who can't even pay for a lawyer or support their families because they were the breadwinners. And nobody. And this is. I don't want to seem agitated or irritated, but like this is really. There's so many different aspects to this. It's disheartening. But I'm glad that I'm out now because I can at least try to give a voice to some of the guys who are not going to have a voice for years if this obstruction thing doesn't get tossed out.
Well, you know, that's just it. You know, what you're talking, you know, even what we're doing with the New California State Movement, there's so many things that are just parallels to what you're talking about in terms of resistance to us and what we've been up to and trying to, you know, become a new state, which is exactly, it's not a simple process. It shouldn't be. We've been at it for like six years seriously as we declared independence 6 years ago. But the number of the cast of characters and everything that you described, we've run into the equivalent on the outside. And trust me, they're here. You know, it's the same thing. You know, it's the same exact stuff.
It's a prescient observation that like people really, again, I think people have a normalcy bias. So even if they don't like the government, they don't really think about this. Like the feds have infiltrated everything from the civil rights movement to the Ku Klux Klan. So you think you can't really get much different than those two positions, but there's nothing they don't infiltrate, whether it's militias, whether it's the anti-war movement, whether it's school board meetings or the Catholic Church. They're always trying to infiltrate and entrap people because they need to control. And to an extent, I get it because the country's so big. You know, like we're an empire, and obviously anybody with a system that they want to maintain wants to stomp out subversion.
Sure.
If stomping out subversion, it comes to the point where you want to entrap basically a third of your population, you've gone a little too far, and you need to take a step back. I think
so. Well, listen, Tim, we got to run for time. I want to thank you very much for jumping in on it and letting us know what's going on. And very intriguing what goes on in the gulag, as they call it, and the suffering that's going on there. We really hope that this can resolve itself very quickly. The only way I see it resolving it is if Donald Trump becomes president, and that can't happen soon enough, in my opinion.
Not at all. Sir, thank you for having me on. If I can, I'd like to, say if you have it in your hearts, go to patriotfreedomproject.com and support, if you can, whatever you can. Try to support some of the families. There's a lot of good people who've been targeted, and you don't have to agree with what happened on January 6th, but if they can do it to us, they can do it to anybody. Please support the families. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, thank you very much. That was Tim Hale. And we really want to thank him for his time and, the time with us anyway. And I'm sure that the healing of the wounds is going to be a long time, as it's going to be a long time for all of us, as we get over this nightmare since 2020, actually since before that, 2010. How about that one in Obama? But, this is the last 4 years, and I keep saying this, that, really Donald Trump has been our president for the last 4 years, exposing in his way all the different things that are out there, all the different cast of characters. And this J6 trial, the trials, I guess you can say, from all the J6 defendants is one of the best ways to find out how things are really progressing. Anyway, thanks for listening to Agenda 21 Radio. Remember to visit our website, a21r.com. And, of course, New California State, State of the Future. Remember, stay strong, America. We are exceptional Americans.